Ma'am, with all due respect, this is overkill for a routine training exercise. Senior Chief Petty Officer Jake Barnes protested as 37-year-old Commander Alexandra Lex Morgan ordered the submarine USS Leviathan into full emergency protocols during what the crew assumed was just another standard drill. What seemed like an overly cautious female commander pushing unnecessary safety measures had become something far more serious. The crew was about to discover that their new CO's paranoid emergency procedures weren't paranoia at all, but the kind of life-saving preparation that only comes from years of underwater crisis management experience. But in exactly 47 minutes, when a catastrophic reactor coolant pump failure would threaten to flood the submarine's engine compartment 300 feet below the Pacific surface, Barnes and the rest of the crew would realize that sometimes the most prepared leader is the one whose excessive training saves everyone's lives, and that expertise earned through proving yourself in the world's most dangerous underwater environments doesn't care about gender stereotypes. Before we dive into this incredible story from 300 feet beneath the Pacific Ocean, where Commander Alexandra Morgan faced a crew that questioned her authority in a mechanical crisis that could have killed them all, tell us in the comments, have you ever had to prove yourself to skeptics who judged you before seeing your capabilities? And if you believe that true leadership means being prepared for the worst-case scenario, even when others call it overkill, hit that subscribe button, because this story will show you the moment when one woman's excessive preparation proved to be the difference between life and death, and how respect is earned not through rank, but through results. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions as the USS Leviathan, a Virginia-class nuclear submarine, prepared for what the crew believed would be another routine training exercise. At 0800 hours on a crisp Tuesday morning, Commander Alexandra Lex Morgan stood in the submarine's control room, her auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her emerald eyes scanning the displays with the intensity of someone who had learned never to take anything for granted. "All stations, report readiness for emergency ascent drill," Lex commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned her position through years of proving herself in situations where mistakes meant death. Senior Chief Petty Officer Jake Barnes, a 20-year submarine veteran with graying temples and the weathered look of someone who had served under a dozen commanders, exchanged glances with Lieutenant Tommy Rodriguez, the boat's young and overconfident navigation officer. Barnes had seen plenty of new commanders come through, but this was their first female CO, and he wasn't convinced she understood the realities of submarine operations. "Ma'am," Barnes said, his tone carefully measured but with an undercurrent of skepticism, "we've run this drill dozens of times. The crew knows the procedures. Maybe we could focus on more practical training today." Lex turned to face Barnes, her expression calm but with steel in her green eyes. "Senior Chief, when was the last time this boat ran a full emergency ascent under simulated reactor coolant failure conditions?" "6 months ago, ma'am," Barnes replied, his voice suggesting he thought the question was unnecessary. "And how long did it take?" Barnes hesitated. 12 minutes, ma'am." 12 minutes, Lex repeated, turning back to the control panel. "In a real emergency, this crew would have been dead in 8. We're running the drill." Lieutenant Rodriguez rolled his eyes at sonar technician First Class Maria Santos, a quiet but observant sailor who had been watching the exchange with interest. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by Lex, who had learned long ago to read the subtle signs of a crew that wasn't taking her seriously. "Problem, Lieutenant?" Lex asked, her voice sharp enough to cut through the control room's ambient noise. Rodriguez straightened, caught off guard. "No, ma'am. Just, well, we've never lost a submarine to reactor failure during routine operations. It seems like we're preparing for problems that don't really happen." Lex stepped closer to Rodriguez, close enough that her voice would carry to the entire control room, but quiet enough to maintain the lieutenant's dignity. "Mr. Rodriguez, how many submarine emergencies have you personally handled?" "Well, ma'am, in training." "Real emergencies, Lieutenant, not simulations." Rodriguez's confidence faltered. "None, ma'am." "I have," Lex said simply. "And I can tell you that the difference between a crew that lives and a crew that dies isn't their routine operations training. It's how they respond when everything goes wrong at once, when there's no time to think, only react. Today, we're going to make sure this crew can react correctly." The control room fell silent except for the constant hum of the submarine systems. Even Barnes, despite his skepticism, recognized the quiet authority in their commander's voice. "Senior Chief," Lex continued, "initiate emergency ascent drill. Full reactor casualty simulation. I want this boat surfaced in under 6 minutes." 6 minutes, ma'am?" Barnes questioned. "Standard procedure calls for—" "Standard procedure gets people killed when the emergency isn't standard," Lex interrupted. 6 minutes. Begin." Barnes nodded reluctantly and reached for the emergency alarm. The klaxon's wail filled the submarine as red lights bathed the control room in an eerie glow. "Emergency ascent drill. Emergency ascent drill," Barnes announced over the intercom. "This is a drill. All hands to emergency stations. Reactor casualty simulation in progress." The crew moved through their positions with the practiced efficiency of sailors who had run this drill countless times, but Lex noticed the subtle signs that they weren't taking it seriously. A slight delay here, a casual conversation there, the kind of complacency that develops when people think they're going through meaningless motions. "Ballast tanks 1 through 4. Emergency blow." Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying the bored tone of someone reciting lines from a script. "Engine room reports ready for emergency ascent," came the voice of Chief Engineering Officer Lieutenant Commander Sarah Kim over the intercom. Lex watched the depth gauge as the submarine began its ascent from 300 feet. 2 minutes had passed, and they were only at 250 feet. At this rate, they would barely make the standard 12-minute time, let alone her 6-minute target. "Mr. Rodriguez, what's our ascent rate?" Lex asked. 50 feet per minute, ma'am. Standard emergency ascent protocol." In a real emergency, standard protocol assumes the reactor cooling system is still functioning, Lex replied. "If we had an actual coolant pump failure, we'd have maybe 4 minutes before reactor temperature reached critical levels. At this rate, we'd be dead before we reached periscope depth." Rodriguez looked uncertain. "Ma'am, emergency ascent procedures are designed to prevent damage to the submarine's hull integrity. If we don't ascend quickly enough, hull integrity becomes irrelevant because we're all dead from radiation poisoning." Lex cut him off. "Senior Chief, increase ascent rate to 100 feet per minute." Barnes hesitated. "Ma'am, that's outside normal parameters." "Do it." The submarine's ascent quickened, but Lex could sense the crew's discomfort with the non-standard procedure. She was about to explain the technical reasoning when Lieutenant Commander Kim's voice crackled urgently over the intercom. "Control engine room, we have a problem down here." The casual atmosphere in the control room evaporated instantly. Lex grabbed the intercom handset. "Engine room, control, what's your status?" "Ma'am, reactor coolant pump number 2 just seized. We're showing a complete loss of primary cooling loop circulation. This isn't part of the drill." Lex felt her stomach drop, but her voice remained steady. "Confirmed, engine room, actual reactor casualty. All hands, this is not a drill. Repeat. This is not a drill. Emergency ascent procedures now in effect." The control room erupted into barely controlled chaos. Rodriguez's face went white as he realized they were facing the exact emergency their commander had been drilling them for. Barnes, his skepticism instantly replaced by professional urgency, began barking orders. "Emergency blow all ballast tanks. Surface immediately. Engine room, shut down reactor and switch to emergency battery power," Lex commanded, her voice cutting through the noise with the calm authority of someone who had trained for this moment her entire career. "Ma'am," Kim's voice was tight with stress, "reactor temperature is climbing rapidly. We've got maybe 6 minutes before we reach emergency shutdown parameters." 6 minutes. Exactly the time frame Lex had been drilling the crew for, but now, with a real emergency, the crew that had been casually going through the motions was struggling to adapt to the sudden reality that their lives depended on the procedures they had been treating as routine. "Rodriguez, what's our depth?" Lex snapped. 200 feet, ma'am, ascending at, Rodriguez fumbled with the controls, his confidence shattered by the real emergency. 120 feet per minute, sonar technician Santos called out, her voice steady despite the crisis. Lex nodded approvingly at Santos, then turned to Rodriguez. "Lieutenant, I need you to focus. What's our time to surface at current ascent rate?" Rodriguez struggled with the calculation, his hands shaking slightly. Approximately 90 seconds, ma'am." "Engine room control," Lex called into the intercom. "Reactor status?" "Temperature still climbing, ma'am." "We're at 80% of emergency shutdown threshold. Maybe 3 minutes until automatic scram. 3 minutes to surface from 200 feet. It was tight, but doable if everything went perfectly. Lex knew from experience that in submarine emergencies, nothing ever went perfectly. As if summoned by her thoughts, the submarine suddenly shuddered and the ascent rate dropped dramatically. "What the hell was that?" Barnes demanded. "Ballast Tank 4 is showing a malfunction," Rodriguez reported, his voice rising with panic. "We're losing buoyancy." Lex moved to the ballast control panel, pushing Rodriguez aside gently but firmly. Her hands flew over the controls with the confidence of someone who had faced this exact scenario before. "Senior Chief, redirect all available compressed air to tanks 1, 2, and 3. We're going to compensate for tank 4 with increased pressure." "Ma'am, that's not standard procedure." "Barnes." Lex's voice cut through the control room like a whip. "Right now, I don't care about standard procedure. I care about getting this boat and this crew to the surface alive. Follow my orders." The authority in her voice was absolute, backed not by rank, but by the unmistakable competence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Barnes nodded and began redirecting the compressed air systems. "Engine room, control, reactor status. Ma'am, we're at 95% of emergency shutdown threshold, maybe 60 seconds before automatic scram." 60 seconds. They were at 150 feet and ascending slowly due to the ballast tank malfunction. At their current rate, they wouldn't make the surface in time. "Santos," Lex called to the sonar technician, "I need you to monitor our ascent rate and call out every 10 feet of depth change." "Aye, ma'am, currently at 140 feet, ascending at approximately 40 feet per minute." Too slow. Way too slow. Lex made a decision that would either save them all or get her court-martialed. "Senior Chief, emergency blow the forward torpedo room auxiliary tank." Barnes stared at her. "Ma'am, that tank isn't designed for emergency ascent. It could damage the torpedo systems. It could also save our lives," Lex replied without hesitation. "Do it." Barnes hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Emergency blow torpedo room auxiliary tank." The submarine lurched upward with sudden force, throwing several crew members off balance, but the ascent rate increased dramatically. 100 feet, ascending at 90 feet per minute, Santos called out. "Engine room, control. Reactor status. Ma'am, we're at 98%. Maybe 20 seconds. 20 seconds. They were at 100 feet. It was going to be close. 80 feet, ascending at 100 feet per minute, Santos reported. 60 feet, ascending at 110 feet per minute. Engine room, we're at 99%. Automatic scram in 10 seconds. 40 feet, Santos called. 20 feet. Periscope depth. Surface, 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 Lex commanded. The submarine broke through the Pacific's surface with a rush of foam and spray, the emergency hatch opening to release the pressure that had built up during their rapid ascent. Emergency battery power kept the essential systems running as the crew worked to stabilize their surface position. In the engine room, Lieutenant Commander Kim's voice came over the intercom with obvious relief. "Control engine room, reactor emergency shutdown complete. All systems secured. We're running on emergency battery power, but we're stable." The control room fell silent except for the sound of heavy breathing and the hum of emergency systems. Slowly, the crew began to realize what had just happened. "Time from emergency to surface?" Lex asked quietly. Santos checked her logs. 5 minutes, 47 seconds, ma'am. 5 minutes, 47 seconds. 13 seconds faster than the 6-minute target Lex had set during their drill. 13 seconds, that had been the difference between life and death. Senior Chief Barnes looked at his commander with new eyes. "Ma'am, if we had been running standard emergency procedures, we would have been at least 2 minutes slower," Lex finished. "The reactor would have scrammed automatically, possibly damaging the cooling systems beyond our ability to repair at sea. At best, we would have been dead in the water waiting for rescue. At worst," she didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the control room understood. Lieutenant Rodriguez stepped forward, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine respect. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. That drill you insisted on, it saved our lives." Lex turned to face her crew, seeing for the first time not skepticism or gender-based doubt, but the respect that could only be earned through competence under pressure. "Gentlemen, ladies," she said quietly, "the ocean doesn't care about our rank, our experience, or our gender. It only cares about our preparation and our ability to execute under pressure. Today, this crew proved they can do both. I'm proud to serve with all of you." Barnes straightened to attention. Ma'am, permission to speak freely? Granted, Senior Chief. Ma'am, in 20 years of submarine service, I've never seen emergency procedures executed with that level of precision under actual crisis conditions. It's been an honor to serve under your command. One by one, the rest of the crew came to attention, their earlier skepticism replaced by the kind of respect that could only be earned through shared danger and proven leadership. As the USS Leviathan waited for the rescue vessels that would tow them back to port for reactor repairs, Commander Alexandra Lex Morgan stood in the control room she had earned through competence rather than protocol, surrounded by a crew that now understood that true leadership isn't about gender or rank. It's about the courage to prepare for the worst and the skill to execute when everything goes wrong. The ocean had tested them all that day, and they had passed. The USS Leviathan floated on the Pacific surface under the afternoon sun, waiting for the USS Phoenix, a rescue vessel dispatched from Naval Base San Diego. Word of the emergency had already reached the highest levels of the Pacific Fleet Command, and Lex knew that her unconventional decisions during the crisis would be scrutinized by officers who hadn't been 300 feet underwater when the reactor coolant pump failed. In the submarine's wardroom, Lex sat across from Senior Chief Barnes and Lieutenant Commander Kim, conducting the mandatory post-incident review. The boat's communication systems had been restored, and she knew that within hours, a formal investigation would begin. Senior Chief, Lex began, I need your honest assessment. My decision to use the torpedo room auxiliary tank, was it necessary or did I unnecessarily risk torpedo system integrity? Barnes considered the question carefully. Ma'am, at the time you gave that order, our ascent rate was insufficient to clear the reactor emergency threshold. Standard procedures would have left us underwater when the automatic scram initiated. In my opinion, you made the only call that could have saved this boat and crew. Lieutenant Commander Kim nodded in agreement. Commander, the engineering data supports that assessment. We had maybe 15 seconds of margin when we surfaced. Without that additional buoyancy from the torpedo room tank, we would have been at least 30 seconds too late. Lex appreciated their support, but she knew that Monday morning quarterbacking from Naval Headquarters might see things differently. The torpedo systems? Minor hydraulic pressure fluctuations, Kim reported. Nothing that can't be repaired in port. Frankly, ma'am, losing some torpedo capability beats losing the entire boat. Before Lex could respond, sonar technician Santos knocked on the wardroom door. Ma'am, excuse me, but we have an incoming transmission from Pacific Fleet Command. Admiral Richardson wants to speak with you directly. Lex felt her stomach tighten. Admiral Patricia Richardson was known throughout the fleet as a demanding officer who didn't tolerate deviations from established procedures. If she was calling personally, it meant the incident had reached the very highest levels of command. Patch it through to the wardroom, Santos. Moments later, Admiral Richardson's voice crackled through the communication system. Commander Morgan, this is Admiral Richardson. I understand you've had an interesting afternoon. Yes, ma'am. We experienced a reactor coolant pump failure during routine training operations. The boat is currently stable on the surface, awaiting assistance. I've received preliminary reports about some unconventional emergency procedures using torpedo room auxiliary tanks for emergency ascent. That's not exactly in the book, Commander. Lex chose her words carefully. Admiral, the standard emergency ascent procedures were insufficient given the reactor casualty timeline. I made the decision to utilize all available buoyancy resources to ensure the safety of the crew. There was a pause. Commander, I've been commanding submarines for 22 years. I've never heard of anyone using torpedo room tanks for emergency ascent. Either you're recklessly incompetent, or you know something the rest of us don't. The preliminary data suggests your boat reached the surface 13 seconds before reactor automatic scram. That's cutting it closer than I've ever seen. Ma'am, the crew performed exceptionally under pressure. We had trained extensively for rapid emergency ascent procedures. Quote, yes, I heard about your training regimen. Some of your crew's family members contacted the base concerned about what they called excessive emergency drills. They were worried you were pushing the crew too hard for routine operations. Lex felt a flash of anger but kept her voice level. Admiral, respectfully, today's emergency validated the importance of that training. Without those drills, this incident could have had a very different outcome. Indeed, it could have. Commander, I'm flying out to inspect your boat personally tomorrow morning. I want a full technical debrief on your emergency procedures, and I want to understand how a routine training exercise turned into a reactor casualty. But I also want to understand how your crew managed the fastest emergency ascent from that depth in Pacific Fleet records." The transmission ended, leaving Lex with mixed feelings. Admiral Richardson's tone had been professional, but impossible to read. Tomorrow's inspection could either validate her decisions or end her career. Admiral Richardson arrived on the USS Phoenix at 0800 hours, accompanied by a team of submarine technical specialists and safety investigators. Lex watched through the periscope as the Admiral's boat approached, noting the crisp efficiency with which the rescue vessel crew handled the transfer. 15 minutes later, Admiral Richardson stood in the USS Leviathan's control room, her silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her uniform bearing the ribbons of someone who had earned respect through decades of submarine service. She was shorter than Lex had expected, but her presence filled the room with unmistakable authority. "Commander Morgan," the Admiral said, extending her hand. "It's been quite some time since I've been aboard a boat that made headlines for emergency procedures. Admiral, I take full responsibility for all operational decisions made during the emergency." "I'm sure you do. But responsibility and competence aren't the same thing. I want to see exactly what happened here, step by step." The Admiral turned to Barnes. "Senior Chief, I understand you've been on submarines for 20 years. In your professional opinion, were Commander Morgan's decisions during the emergency appropriate?" Barnes straightened to attention. "Admiral, in my 20 years of submarine service, I've never seen a commander handle an actual emergency with that level of precision and effectiveness. Commander Morgan's training regimen and emergency procedures saved this boat and every person on it." "Strong words, Senior Chief. What about the use of torpedo room auxiliary tanks? That's not standard procedure." "No, ma'am, it's not. But when your reactor is about to scram and you're still 100 feet underwater, standard procedures become irrelevant. The commander made a decision that saved our lives." Admiral Richardson nodded and turned to Lieutenant Rodriguez. "Lieutenant, I understand you had some concerns about your commander's training methods before yesterday's incident." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, but answered honestly. "Yes, ma'am. I did. I thought the emergency drills were excessive and unnecessary. I was wrong. Commander Morgan's insistence on rapid emergency procedures was the only reason we're alive to have this conversation." The Admiral spent the next 2 hours reviewing technical data, interviewing crew members, and examining the torpedo room auxiliary tank system that Lex had used for the emergency ascent. Her technical team ran diagnostics on the reactor systems and analyzed the timeline of the emergency response. Finally, Admiral Richardson called Lex to the wardroom for a private conversation. "Commander, sit down," the Admiral said, her tone unreadable. "I've reviewed the technical data, interviewed your crew, and analyzed your emergency response procedures. I've also spoken with submarine commanders throughout the Pacific Fleet about rapid emergency ascent techniques." Lex waited, unsure whether she was about to be commended or court-martialed. "In my 22 years of submarine command, I have never seen emergency procedures executed with that level of effectiveness under actual crisis conditions. Your use of the torpedo room auxiliary tank was unconventional, but it was also brilliant. You saved this boat and 43 lives." Lex felt a wave of relief, but maintained her composure. "Thank you, ma'am." However, the Admiral continued, "I'm concerned about the complaints from crew families about excessive training. A commander who pushes too hard can create morale problems." "Admiral, respectfully, I believe the results speak for themselves. The crew that complained about excessive training yesterday is the same crew that executed a flawless emergency ascent under actual crisis conditions." Admiral Richardson smiled for the first time since boarding. "Commander, you sound like someone who understands that submarines don't forgive mistakes. Your crew is alive because you prepared them for the worst-case scenario. That's exactly the kind of leadership the submarine service needs." The Admiral stood and extended her hand again. "Commander Morgan, I'm recommending you and your crew for commendations for exceptional performance under emergency conditions. I'm also asking you to develop a training protocol based on your emergency procedures that can be implemented fleet-wide. Other submarine crews need to learn what your crew already knows. That excessive preparation is what keeps submarines and sailors alive." As Admiral Richardson prepared to leave, she turned back to Lex. "One more thing, Commander. I've heard some officers suggest that female submarine commanders might not handle crisis situations as effectively as their male counterparts. Yesterday, you proved that competence and leadership have nothing to do with gender and everything to do with preparation, training, and the courage to make difficult decisions under pressure. The submarine service is better because officers like you are willing to serve. But more importantly, they had learned that sometimes the most valuable leaders are the ones who seem overly prepared. Because in the world's most dangerous environments, there's no such thing as being too ready for the moment when preparation becomes the difference between life and death.